You know, I was reading Sam Faddis's latest in A&D magazine, how history never fades in the Middle East, and what is ancient to Americans today is alive and well in places like Iran. It sort of got me to thinking about balancing hope and reality in a dangerous moment. The headlines and reports coming out of the Middle East are no longer whispers or speculation. We just remind you that oil prices have surged dramatically, military strikes are being confirmed, and Iran's internal leadership transition appears to be consolidating hardline power. And these are not rumors, these are real developments unfolding in real time. And yet, even when the facts themselves are real, the interpretation of those facts is where uncertainty begins. One camp argues, Sam, that the conflict may be approaching its decisive phase, that sustained military pressure and could force Iran to retreat, degrade its capabilities, and ultimately shorten the conflict. We even heard President Trump in a press conference saying, we're nearing the end, we're almost near, they don't have much left. And yet, we have another camp that fears the opposite, that what we are witnessing may be the early stages of a broader regional war that could draw in additional powers, disrupt global energy markets, and test the fragile stability of the international order. Both possibilities, I would say, could exist at the same time. But I want to go back to Sam because he said something about history. And history reminds us that wars often appear contained until suddenly they're not. And small escalations can trigger larger alignments, especially when global powers have strategic interests tied to the outcome. So how do we balance these realities, Sam, and connect the realities of where Americans are and the realities is what ancient history has taught you about what we see now in the Middle East? And welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you. It is great to be here as always. Look, Armstrong, I think I come back to this every time anybody asks me about this conflict. I mean, we have to start with the question of what are our objectives? What are we trying to achieve, and how does this end? Which for me is the question you have to answer before you ever start a war, right? What exactly are we doing, and how precisely are we going to achieve that, and how do we foresee this ending? If the objective is, or morphs into, we're going to beat the hell out of the Iranians, take away a bunch of capabilities, sink their navy, destroy their missiles, defang them, if you will, at least temporarily, then I think that is something that is achievable in a relatively short period of time, whatever the heck that is, weeks. And we can tie this thing off and potentially avoid the more serious downsides. If we persist in the idea that the war continues until the regime is gone and there's fundamental change in Iran and we are participating in choosing the new leadership, et cetera, then I think we have a fundamentally different prospect, because no matter how badly they've been wounded, I don't think this regime is going to surrender. They're just going to dig in and take the war in unconventional directions, and it will be cheap drones increasingly directed at civilian targets, attacks on embassies abroad, attacks potentially inside the United States. I mean, the kind of thing where they don't have to stand toe-to-toe with the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army, but they can do this for a very long time. And the longer that the further we go down that road, if that's the direction it goes, then there are going to be all these stress fractures that are going to go in a myriad of different directions based on all sorts of ancient historical animosities. I mean, look, the Iranians hit a British base on the island of Cyprus with a drone. They attacked the Brits, a base that is sovereign British territory on Cyprus. The Greeks the nation of Greece is up in arms because they regard the Cypriots as their brothers. So they're now surging their navy and their air force to Cyprus to defend it against the Muslim invaders. The Persians are back. Now the Turks are all fired up because the Greeks, the island of Cyprus is divided between Greeks and Turks, and the Turks view this as an attempt by the Greeks to invade Cyprus. So now they're talking about surging their air force to Cyprus. So we got two NATO allies getting ready to go at it in a fight because the Persians attacked Cyprus. And that kind of, just sort of mad, unpredictable thing is going to continue to happen, and it's going to get worse.
Talk about where the United States and Israel have made progress in this escalation, and what is it that we don't acknowledge about where Iran has been able to strike deeply that could bring about great consequences as it relates itself to the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, look, there is no more Iranian Navy. There is no more Iranian Air Force. I would imagine by this point their ballistic missile force, anything that actually involves a fixed position and constitutes a significant target, that all of those things have been hit, probably some of them multiple times. So all of that capability is gone, and obviously the leadership has been decimated. But the thing is, these guys, so that's all gone, but they're not quitting, and they're going to continue to fight. So now they're going to use cheap drones that they can build for, they build them for like $50,000, and we shoot them down with missiles that cost $1 million, literally. And increasingly, they're using these kinds of things to hit targets that aren't U.S. military targets. I mean, now we're seeing them taking out refineries. I think the only refinery in Bahrain in the Gulf is gone. A number of other major oil facilities are gone. Desalinization plants are now being hit. There's 100 million people in that region who get all their water from the sea. It's via desalinization plants because it's a giant desert, right? So you got 100 million people relying on desalinization plants that are now becoming targets. And already, in effect, essentially all oil production from the region has gone offline. Even if you haven't destroyed the facilities, some of them have been damaged. Other places, they shut them down because they're worried they might be damaged. And then the rest of them they're not going to pump because they don't have any place to put the oil, literally. The tankers anchored offshore are full and they aren't moving. And the oil storage tanks are full. So they're shutting down the oil fields, and no oil. I mean, as of this point, no oil or natural gas is coming out of the Gulf, basically. That's about whatever it is, 20% of the world's supply, just as of right now, it doesn't exist.
So tell us about the new Supreme Leader.
Well, he's the son of the old Supreme Leader, and he represents, I mean, in my view, the decision to appoint this guy is their ultimate way of giving us
the finger. Yeah.
And saying, screw you, we're not backing off an inch here. And it occurs to me, and I want to be careful with this analogy because I'm really not trying to equate two very different cultures. But, we fought the Japanese in the Second World War. And what we learned when we went island to island was you had to kill everybody. I mean, literally. You have islands that were 20,000 Japanese soldiers were on the island. At the end, they were all dead, and other than like 200 we captured. And if you actually look at the fine print, you realize the 200 we captured didn't surrender. They were so incapacitated in one way or the other that they couldn't resist anymore. So in essence, none of them ever surrendered. And we recognize, that's why we ultimately dropped nuclear weapons on Japan, right? Because the estimates were we were going to lose 500,000 guys if we had to invade Japan because we knew what we were up against. So again, I'm not equating the two cultures. I'm just saying we have fought enemies before where telling them to surrender didn't do a damn thing. I mean, they just dug in and said, yeah, we'll fight to the death.
What do you see as the president's blind spots?
I am afraid that he was convinced, and probably in large measure by the Israelis, but I don't want to pin this exclusively on them, that if we undertook this massive attack on the Iranian regime, that these guys would see the light and make a deal, that they would knuckle under. And I think, that comes from assuming that the other guys have the same worldview that you do, that they operate sort of in the same universe and they see the world the same way, and no rational person would just sit there and let their country get pounded and their military destroyed and their leadership killed and not ultimately raise a white flag. But, and I don't want to pin this on the Iranian people as a whole, but the Iranian leadership has an apocalyptic worldview, right? They think we're at the end of times. They're waiting for the Mahdi to come back, who is sort of this Iranian Superman, a 1,500-year-old imam that's been in hiding, and he's going to come back. And when he comes back, they're going to win. And by win, meaning they will conquer the world, and you will either be eliminated or assimilated in one way or the other. And it's not a metaphor, and it's not a fairy tale for them. They actually believe that. And by the way, they believe that in order for all that to happen, of necessity, we sort of have to go through Armageddon, and their version of Armageddon. In other words, fire, brimstone, world war are not just, it's okay to tolerate that. It's like that's a precondition. That's the only way you get from here to their eventual victory. So somebody claiming that you're going to bomb these guys and then they're going to quit and surrender and run up the white flag either doesn't understand how they're put together or is deliberately feeding you a line to manipulate you.
This is Your Voice, Your Future. We'll be back with much more with Sam Faddis. And welcome back. Sam, what role is Russia
strategically
and China playing behind the scene? Are they playing a material role? Are they providing them with intelligence?
Well, look, the reports are that the Russians are providing, at least the Russians are providing targeting data to the Iranians. They're telling them, providing all the information they need to hit targets. I believe that absolutely. I mean, I would think they would be jumping for joy and clicking their heels, because we have been providing all the targeting data to the Ukrainians for years now to hit targets inside Russia, and now they get it payback. This is ultimate payback. They get to provide all that data. The Chinese have.
So let me stop you there before you go on. So the president spoke with Putin today, and he said Putin wanted to be helpful, but he told him he could be helpful by ending the Ukraine-Russian conflict. Do you think the president trusts Putin?
I don't think so. I mean, my hesitation is caused, based on my previous line of work, the concept of trust doesn't exist, right? There is no such thing as, in national security, there should never be any such thing as trust, right? What was the old line, trust but verify? I mean, you said something, Putin, okay, if I can confirm that means something and that's real and have a reason to believe it, then I'll believe it, but I don't care. Just the fact that those words came out of your mouth doesn't mean anything to me. And to be honest, I mean, I think what we know about Trump is that Trump is very conscious of the power of what he says. Sometimes he makes threats. I don't think he necessarily intends to follow through on those threats, but it's kind of a negotiating tactic. And sometimes when he's talking about people like Putin, he's not going to criticize them to the whole world, no matter what he really thinks, because it doesn't help, right? Slapping the guy in the face publicly and doesn't assist us in any fashion. I mean, the Putin absolutely is going to help the Iranians to the extent he can. But again, I mean, keep in mind that whether we're talking about Russia or China, I mean, what's the first priority? The first priority is whatever is good for them. They'll help the Iranians if it sticks it to us and it doesn't hurt them too much. Ultimately, if it becomes too much if they're too entangled and it looks like there's too much downside, they'll also just walk away from the Iranians and cut them loose. They don't care.
And China?
And the Chinese, I mean, have provided a lot of material assistance. There have been reports in the last day or two that there are ships leaving China carrying what appears to be the precursor material to build solid rocket fuel headed for Iran. So basically resupplying the Iranians with what they need to make the fuel to build more rockets. Now, what I don't fully understand yet is how anybody thinks those ships are ever going to make it to Iran, but maybe they're going to dock somewhere else and then proceed overland. I don't know at this point.
What about the cyber and asymmetric warfare? Does that concern you?
Yeah, 100%. Look, we bombed the heck out of the North Vietnamese too, right? We bombed all kinds of people in Indochina. I think we dropped more bombs on Laos than we ever dropped on Nazi Germany. In the end, they just didn't fight in a way that was particularly susceptible to those kinds of conventional attacks, right? So that's the direction, absolutely, the Iranians are going to go in every sense. So I was talking earlier about cheap drones. It's not just that they're cheap. The technology is simple. You can build these drones in any kind of building that looks from the air like anything, a warehouse, a school, a private residence. So that transforms the whole targeting situation. But they also have these so-called surrogates, Hezbollah, other groups like that, all over the Middle East, but actually all over the world they have contacts. They have huge contacts with the Mexican cartels, the Iranians do. They undoubtedly have Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force operatives inside the United States, especially because the borders have been non-existent for 4 years. So they got all kinds of serious people all over the place who have the capacity to blow things up, kill people, and renders B-1 bombers, B-2 bombers, B-52 bombers, aircraft carriers are now irrelevant in that kind of war right now. Now it's a war in the shadows, and it's much more of a level playing field from their perspective.
I was thinking about history, and we sort of fixate ourselves on personalities of the moment. If you look at, you just mentioned Vietnam. If you mention Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, there was Hugo Chavez before there was Maduro. You look at Stalin. You look at all these personalities, and we tend to think that personalities dominate the future, but they're there for the moment. It's the culture that sustains eras. And so no matter how often you may change the leadership, the culture is so rooted, the culture continues not because of, but in spite of the personality.
Yeah, and look, the Iranians, let's call them the Persians, this is an ancient civilization, right? I was just talking about the Greeks a little while ago. Well,
yes.
I mean, the Greeks were teeing off against the Persians at Marathon and Thermopylae, Salamis, etc., whatever that is now, 2,500 years ago, when the Romans were spreading their empire. Probably the single greatest enemy they ever had were the Persians, more than the Germans, any of those guys. I mean, they lost a whole bunch of really big battles to the Persians. This is a really ancient civilization, and it's very organized, and these guys, I mean, having worked against the Iranians for years, against their intelligence service and the Quds Force, et cetera, they're very squared away. I mean, they're brutal as hell. And I have no sympathy for those organizations, but I can tell you from experience, if you don't have your act together and you want to go play in the same place with them, it's going to go really, really badly for you. They are going to take you to the cleaners. They are going to kill you in very large numbers. So nobody should start going down some road of dismissing these guys as chumps or anything. That is absolutely not the case. One of the things they've already done is, in response to our they did this before this war began. They had set up 30 plus regional commands. So basically, it doesn't matter if the center is destroyed and they can't get orders from Tehran anymore. All of these separate commands continue to fight. It's almost like some organism where you cut off the head, but it doesn't die. So you can bomb Tehran forever, but individual commanders in all these places are going to keep fighting as best they can. You're going to have to kill all of those pieces one by one.
So did the U.S. do the right thing by shutting down 2 of its Middle Eastern military bases? And just how vulnerable are those bases in the Middle East if Iran decides to continue to retaliate against American assets?
Well, all of them are vulnerable, which is not to dismiss the missile defense or protect. I mean, we are and have been since the beginning intercepting virtually all of the missiles and drones that are sent. The problem is, particularly when you start talking about these low-cost drones, they can keep sending them and they can build them almost as fast as they need them, and we can't intercept all of them. And if you're shooting at a big base and it's filled with troops, at some point anything you hit inside the base is a valid target, right? So are we, I would hope that where we are withdrawing people, we're withdrawing people because it won't hurt us to move them elsewhere where they are less vulnerable. That's what I hope we're doing.
Well, one thing that's a fact, we may not be on the battlefield in the Middle East fighting this war as soldiers, but we certainly feel the impact of it at the pump, with how dependence on fertilizer and how it will affect the food crops in this country, and so much more.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think oil is at $100 a barrel now. It's not impossible that oil will be at $200 a barrel if this thing continues for an extended period of time the way it is. And if we start talking about more and more about not just closing facilities temporarily, but we start talking about refineries being taken offline completely, like they have to be rebuilt, then it's not a matter of when the war's over, you flip the switch again, right? Then it's a matter of you got to rebuild it from scratch. Same thing with desalination plants. Like the Israelis took some out in Gaza right after, the attacks on Israel by Hamas. Those facilities, those desalination plants that the Israelis took out in Gaza are still offline. I mean, they're trying to rebuild them, but they still haven't managed to rebuild them, even with United Nations in there. So it takes a long time. It's a big facility.
So I have to get this in as my last question to you before we say goodbye. The president said that they would use their Navy carriers to make sure they escort their ships and cargo through the Strait of Hormuz, but yet there's this narrative that the Iranians still control the Strait of Hormuz. What are the facts?
Well, the fact is you're talking about commercial vessels, and you're talking about private companies, and you're talking about insurance companies. So the strait is closed whenever the commercial company says the risk is too high for us from a profit perspective, or the insurance company says, and this has already happened, we won't insure your tanker. So at that point, from a practical standpoint, the strait is closed because nobody's risking losing that super tanker filled with oil and eating the cost. And that's precisely where we are right now.
Listen, Sam, your final thoughts? I mean, it's always a pleasure having you on Mondays at this time to continue to update us on the escalating and hopefully soon the de-escalating conflict in the Middle East.
Look, if I was sitting there talking to the president, I would say, listen, take out capabilities, defang them, disarm them, declare victory, and go home, and abandon any thought of regime change. And we have to have an unconditional surrender. That is not going to happen, and it's going to get worse for us if we try to achieve it.
Sam Faddis, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back with much more. So let me welcome in studio Nathan Worcester, politics reporter for the Epoch Times. Welcome to the broadcast. And our very own Raynard Jackson. Always a pleasure seeing you, Raynard. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start here. I was so struck by New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, and this intensified after reports about what happened at Gracie Mansion, that these terrorists, or whatever you want to call them, were so emboldened with law enforcement and police all around, they detonate these cocktails with no fear. I mean, Raynard, it was so brazen. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it's as if, shoot me if you want to, take me out, but I'm on a mission here.
Yeah, Armstrong, this is what happens when you have the reputation as a city of not being punitive when people break the law. And so these two terrorists, and it is amazing, Armstrong, that ABC News referred to both of them as activists handing another activist a incendiary device. No, these are terrorists, but they know if they do get locked up, they could be out on bail before the paperwork is submitted by law enforcement. And then if they are convicted, they're probably going to get a slap on the wrist, Armstrong, and they'll be out within 5 or 10 years. And these guys are, what, 18, 19 years old. So you got to create an environment, Armstrong, in the U.S. where if you violate the law, there's got to be certain and swift punishment.
So Nathan, how do you think all this is tied to the escalation conflict between Iran, the United States, and Israel, and how do you think that's playing out on the U.S. soil? Do you think we'll see more of that? Do you think there's sleeper cells that can become emboldened by what we just saw in New York City in broad daylight?
Yeah, it's hard to fathom. It seems as though we're returning to an era of political violence. And some of that is domestic, but a lot of that, as we're seeing, appears to bear the hallmarks of inspiration. In the case of what happened in Austin recently, for example, I think there's still an investigation ongoing, but certainly it would seem to signal, based upon the T-shirt that gunman was wearing, that we're looking at some sort of unrestricted warfare, one might say, or incidents inspired by geopolitical events. I certainly hope that this will bring more attention to the need to, if nothing else, seriously reconsider the tolerance maybe for rhetoric that we've heard that while there's, I think, a place to be skeptical of the excesses of law enforcement, I wonder if Mayor Mamdani will be rethinking some of what he has been saying, or at least some of what his party has been emphasizing when it comes to what, in the case of someone now who's being targeted by this kind of violence, seems like, to use the old saying, that thin blue line between order and chaos.
Thinking about what Nathan said, Raynard, I mean, you think about his wife who lacked a social media post expressing sympathy for those responsible for the October 7th attacks in Israel. I mean, that was not just a protest or political expression. It was literally a massacre carried out by Hamas. Families were murdered, civilians hunted down, children kidnapped, and communities terrorized. And any gesture, Nathan and Raynard, that appears to minimize such brutality deserves clear condemnation. And when the mayor was pressed about this, He said she's a private citizen, and she said that as a private citizen, and she has a right to her opinion. I mean, Raynard, what are we missing here?
Yeah, Armstrong, again, when the focus is on the individual, the I, the me, you lose that sense of collective unity. There was a time, Armstrong, when a foreigner was admitted into the U.S. from wherever part of the world, they were Russian who wanted to become an American. And now people are wanting to be American and remain Russian. And so we have to look at our immigration system and only admit, Armstrong, those who truly want to live the American dream and the American life. And so when you have people constantly trying to focus on the individual, we lose that collective, we are Americans first. And I'm from Switzerland, Africa, wherever secondarily, we've lost that sense of unity, Armstrong, and now we're seeing that play out every day.
So Nathan, you've studied a lot about China and about Russia. I mean, I know I talked to Sam about this, and I know the president spoke with the president of Putin today, and Sam did point out that the United States was definitely involved in pointing out how to sort of pinpoint the best way to target Russia, and they were getting this intelligence from the United States. And so, what is Russia doing? Russia is doing the same. But is anything deeper that they could get involved in that could propel Iran to sustain itself, to continue escalating this conflict with no end in sight?
Well, I think Sam really put it well, talking about the indications that we have of China, for example, perhaps sending material that could be used in weapons. There's been reporting, of course, of Russia providing intelligence support, which one might say, yes, you would expect these countries. It would be strange if they didn't provide that sort of support to Iran. On the other hand, we have Trump encouraging India to purchase Russian oil and gas. We have talk of perhaps sanctions being eased there. And we're also looking at the end of the month at a meeting between China, between Xi Jinping and President Trump. There's been some speculation in Chinese media I've seen that Iran might feel an incentive to hold on until then. At the same time, and I'm drawing on Epoch Times reporting here, there are some indications within the party itself from China of a certain amount of panic or disquiet. There was a sense that I think they had, perhaps based on some of the rhetoric that we've heard from the administration, some of the, we're not interested in starting a new Middle Eastern war stuff, and also U.S. hesitancy to engage in any sort of sustained strikes on Iran, given the costs that it would seem to be bringing to bear. China might be caught off guard here. And so for at least a few days, for example, we saw China halting its flights over or around Taiwan. They've resumed those. And as I said previously, we are just weeks away from what could be a decisive summit. I should say, looking at the broader chessboard, Venezuela to some extent has been taken out of the sphere of Chinese influence, perhaps. We saw Assad in Syria fall, and so that matters significantly for Russia. Also to China. That being said, Venezuela apparently just booked a shipment of oil to China, and President Trump is, if nothing else, a bit of a deal maker when it comes to the global flow of commerce. So it's going to be interesting to watch those trends in the next few days and weeks.
So, Raynard, China depends heavily on Middle Eastern energy. How concerned is Beijing about the instability in the region?
Oh, they're very concerned. I think one of the things Trump is doing that he's not getting credit for, Armstrong and Nathan, is notice you got Venezuela in the Western Hemisphere, you got Iran in the Middle East, you got certain strategic countries in Africa that Trump is cutting strategic mineral deals with. And what's the common thread among all these countries? They all are tied to China and or Russia. Now Trump has leverage. If China wants to invade Taiwan, which most experts think is a matter of when, not if, all of a sudden now Trump can go to Xi Jinping at the end of the month and say, well, I would think twice about that because I control the oil coming out of Iran and Venezuela. Where are you going to get your energy from? So I think Trump is trying to play chess versus checkers and align himself with options down the road to contain Russia and China.
Let's bring it home. How is Trump going to deal with the Supreme Court ruling, and now the courts are demanding that he pay these tariffs back to these businesses?
I think that we're going to see the attempt, at least, to use those alternative authorities that he's spoken about. At the same time, yes, that's a challenge for the United States as it continues to confront, even prior to these tariffs coming in and supplying a bit of revenue, a very challenging balance sheet. I think just in the past year or two, a few more trillion added to it. The one big beautiful bill, that reconciliation bill, in the words of Chip Roy last summer, it seems to be front-loaded on costs and back-loaded on revenue. So I really do think spending is going to remain a challenge for the administration. On the other hand, it doesn't seem as though this tariff war is necessarily over. And we see, I think, to some extent, regardless of what the statutes might say, as this attempt by the president to exercise executive authority to advance not just economic but also foreign policy goals, we see tariffs being treated in this way that I believe that whatever happens with the revenue on the tariffs, we're likely to continue to see a similar playbook from the administration moving forward. That being said, and I believe I emphasized this last week, we're seeing a bit of skittishness from congressional Republicans. For example, Dan Newhouse, one of the people who voted to repudiate, or rather to rebuke, the tariffs recently, the ones on, I believe, Canada, he, when I asked him, said, yes, I'm not sure about the constitutionality of what we're seeing. So will be interesting to watch if there's any sort of growing gap between the House, the Senate, and then the President.
Let me close with this with Raynard. You know what? There are a lot of people in the president's base that's against this escalation of war in the Middle East. And then you also have these gas prices, and the economy is being impacted by this war. How does this further impact their chances of maintaining control of the House and the Senate, Raynard?
Well, I tell you, if gas prices are where they are today in September, October, it's inevitable that we will definitely lose the House and possibly the Senate. And so I think there's a small window, Armstrong, still remaining for the president to get energy under control. But also, I think I would like to see the president spend a little bit more time, Armstrong, dealing with domestic issues. Mm-hmm. His presidency in the second term is definitely known for foreign policy. That's not what we voted for last November. We voted for domestic policy, and he's given us foreign policy. So he got a short window to turn this around, Armstrong, but the House and the Senate are in jeopardy. And if we lose either body, and especially the House, Armstrong, President Trump will be impeached on January of 27, guaranteed.
Wow. Listen, Nathan and Raynard, thank you so much for your insights. Dr. Sina McCullough is coming up next from Make America Healthy Again, and Keep Your Hands Off My Food. We'll be back. Don't go away. Let us welcome Dr. McCullough back through to the broadcast. Dr. McCullough, who would you like to have keep their hands off your food?
Great question. The government and industry, quite frankly. And I would like more Americans, more consumers to put their hands on the food.
And how do you make that possible?
Yeah, so in my opinion, we blindly trust our food supply. Like most of us walk into the grocery store and we think that that food's safe. Because at the end of the day, we think that somebody, it's government or industry, is actually making sure that that food's been tested for safety, toxicity, and long-term testing. But that's actually not what I found in my investigation. Our food supply is actually sicker. It's more toxic than it's ever been in the history of our nation. And it's making us sick. So 75% of adults and nearly 30% of children actually now suffer from at least one chronic condition. And my thesis behind this whole book is that we actually have the power, the consumers have the power to turn that ship around, that we've largely abdicated our responsibility to be watchdogs over our food. We did that about 100 years ago with the birth of the federal FDA. And I don't think people actually understand our role in the food supply. I know I didn't. It took me nearly dying from an autoimmune disease to wake up to the fact that our food supply is adulterated and it's making us sick. I didn't realize that the government wasn't doing the job that I thought it was supposed to do. I mean, after all, we pay our tax dollars to the FDA and the USDA to presumably protect our food, but they're actually not doing what most of us think they're supposed to do.
So are you implying that the government regulations don't necessarily protect consumers, and what they actually do is restrict healthier options?
Yes. So there's a lot to unpack there, but quick example is for the Farm Bill. I know the Farm Bill doesn't sound very sexy, and most people don't think it applies to them because they're not farmers. But the Farm Bill actually determines, in large part, why fruits and vegetables are so expensive, why junk food is so cheap. It determines, in large part, what is in our processed foods. So the government actually incentivizes farmers to grow a handful of crops. Usually it's corn, soy, wheat, rice, and cotton. Corn and soy are largely genetically engineered. You know, about 97% of the corn grown in America is genetically engineered, which means it's sprayed with glyphosate. So many farmers are incentivized to produce those crops because the government pays them to do it. So what happens is you get the surplus of crops, and we process that surplus in part into cheap synthetic byproducts that end up in our processed food. So, for example, high fructose corn syrup is derived from these genetically modified corn that's sprayed with glyphosate, and it's cheaper than, let's say, cane sugar because the government subsidized those crops, and also because of the Farm Bill, the government makes cane sugar artificially inflated in price. So a lot of times companies have stopped using cane sugar, the natural sugar, and instead substituted that with high fructose corn syrup because it's more expensive because of what the government is doing to fix the prices.
Well, why do some ingredients banned in other countries still appear in American food products?
I'm so glad you brought that up. So that's because in other countries, their citizens are actively being watchdogs over their food supply. So you'll see there's like Texas passed a law where they're banned like 44 chemicals, I believe it was, that are in our food supply, but are actually not allowed in the food supply in the European Union. And literally those chemicals got into our food because the consumers aren't aware of what's happening, and we're not standing up. Like in Europe, they'll do protests. So GMOs rolled out in Europe and they stopped them. Meanwhile, we've been consuming them for decades, and a lot of people still don't even understand how many GMOs they're consuming. So we've kind of fallen asleep at the wheel, and I don't say that with any kind of judgment because that was me as well. I trusted that the government was doing the job of protecting the food to be safe.
But I do think that one of the things you want to do is make the connection how the rise in chronic disease is connected to the food system we have today.
Oh, absolutely. So if you look at in the scientific literature, you can look over the past 100 years, and there's been this explosion of chronic diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, autoimmune conditions. It maps perfectly with the introduction of many chemicals in our food supply in the last 60 years. So not only chemicals in the ultra processed foods, but genetically modified organisms. Glyphosate matches almost perfectly with the rise in these chronic diseases. And to me, the most important evidence for how the adulterated food is linked to disease is that we can actually reverse chronic and autoimmune diseases. I'm a living testimony to that. But the way that you reverse it is the first thing that you do is you put people on a whole food diet that is organic. So you have to remove all these synthetic chemicals, the pesticides, herbicides, GMOs. And once you even just do that component, about 60% of people can actually reverse these chronic and autoimmune conditions that they're suffering from. So to me, that's the biggest piece of evidence. That's real world evidence
So
that the food is making us sick.
So tell us in the little time we have left, if consumers want to take control of their health, what are the most important changes they should start with now?
I love that question. So read your food labels. If a couple things, obviously try to opt for whole organic foods whenever possible. But we all consume processed foods, even ketchup is processed. So flip over that package and read the label.
Oh, wow.
An easy rule of thumb is if there's an ingredient on there that you can't pronounce or that you wouldn't find in your own kitchen, put it back on the shelf. You probably shouldn't be eating that. So those are two quick starting points for anybody.
How does somebody go out and get your book, and why is it so important?
So you can get my book on Amazon, and my website's drsinamccullough.com. And it's important because we're losing our health. Like I said, children, 30% of them have a chronic illness now. About 77% of all young people don't even qualify for military service anymore because they can't pass the physical fitness test. So it's really important to not only secure our health, like return to a healthy vitality, of a nation, but also because we're losing freedoms that some of us didn't even know we've lost. I know we don't have much time, but for example, the government allows products to be sold on the grocery store shelves that come from experimental trials. So many of us consumed milk from experimental trials for about 8 years in this country before that milk was even approved for human consumption. And it wasn't labeled because the FDA doesn't think we have the right to know when they put experimental products on the market.
So quickly, what policy changes would you create for a healthier food environment?
Well, so the one of the big things they could do is Congress can remove the grass loophole, which is the generally recognized as safe loophole, which and Congress has to do it because they passed the bill. Like Kennedy can't do it. So Congress passed this law, and there's this loophole where companies can self-certify their own chemicals and foods as safe. And genetically modified organisms actually slip through that loophole. So the FDA never tested GMOs for safety. And there's about roughly 10,000 chemicals in our food supply that many of them fell through that grass loophole. And the problem is the FDA doesn't actually know how many chemicals are in our food supply because the process of the company who makes the chemical and puts it in our food, the process of them notifying the FDA to tell them that chemical is in our food, that process is voluntary. And guess who made it voluntary? The FDA. So that's an example of how the FDA is not doing the job that we think they're supposed to do. And Congress has passed that law with this major loophole in it that has contaminated our food supply. So even if Congress could just get rid of that grass loophole, that's a big step forward.
You know, what you just described is insanity at its worst on steroids. Listen, Dr. McCullough, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you always for willing to come on our broadcast to share the truth with our audience. Are you working on a new book anytime soon?
I actually am. My next book is going to be teaching people step by step how to reverse chronic and autoimmune diseases.
Oh, wow. Well, that is, and it's particularly in children.
Oh, yes. Yes, I have 3 children. My son had autism. My other son had Lyme disease, and we reversed them completely. You would never know today that my son was autistic.
Well, you know, he's fortunate to have great parents who really spend their time researching, not just for, and I'm sure that's part of the impetus for why you do what you do and people that you really care about in your profession. Thank you so much for joining us. And let us thank all our earlier guests for joining us for this edition of Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. I'm Armstrong Williams. Good night.